Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Nepean Sailing Club Winter Speaker Series. I think this is our sixth talk of the winter. I'm Jeff Smith, a member here at NSC, and I serve as our Master of Ceremonies to kind of get us launched for our speaker series. Up to getting it fixed. So Eric, come on up.
On that note, hi, I'm Eric. I'm an alcoholic. Oh, it's not that kind of night. Sorry. That's tomorrow, right? So hi, I'm Eric. I'm an electrician, marine electrician specifically. So, all right. So I started sailing, I was about the age of 12 on my father's None Such 30, and since then I have a love for these boats, and basically all boats, especially if they have sails. Around the age of 30, I got a Tanzer 7.5, so very original choice, obviously. Nobody ever gets a Tanzer as a first boat, not around here. And I was a member here at Nepean Sailing Club for about 4 or 5 years. About 5 years ago, I moved up to an Ontario 32, which I'm very, very in love with, and on which I've spent way too much money on the electrical as well as the other systems. From an electrical perspective, I've been tinkering with pretty much anything that has wires. I think first thing I held was probably a spoon, and after that, probably a pair of pliers. I studied computer and electronics in Cégep, and then I worked the corporate world for a while, decided to retire out of that rat race, and got into a whole lot of sailing, a whole lot of trouble with my electric system, started learning, helping others, learning more, taking on some little jobs, eventually deciding, hey, maybe I'm just gonna get certified. It looks like I might kind of know what I'm doing. And since then, I have been a licensed ABYC marine electrician. My old boat, not that sexy. My new boat, a lot cuter. All right, so we're gonna take a look at the basic concepts. Basically, what is a volt? What is amperage? What are amp hours? What are watts? We're gonna try to go through real quick. Actually, who was here last year when I did my presentation, the first one? All right. A lot of stuff is the same because I want to make sure we cover that, because if we get talking about watts, amps, and nobody knows what I'm talking about, it's not all that useful. So we're going to talk about that. Battery selection, taking a look at the different options that are available on the market, mainly lithium. Different types of battery switch and how to use it optimally. 120 volts away from the dock, or here even at the dock because we do not have shore power. Energy saving tips. Spoiler alert, use LEDs everywhere. That's basically the gist of it. Mast wiring, that's one that came up with a lot of questions. We wanted to make sure we have it in there. How to generate power, again, away from the dock, or even at the dock if we don't have shore power. And designing a basic solar system, as well as battery monitors that directly ties to it. Now, the basic concepts. So we got, now my pointer is red and not cooperating for some reason. I don't know if I'm having a technical challenge or a boomer moment. Because I'm getting that weird cursor and nothing else. Help! Help! I don't know if I'm doing something wrong or if the computer doesn't like me.
Page 10?
I haven't. Oh, and now the cursor is back. It saw you. It got, you know? Yeah. That computer knows who's the boss. So I'll keep you on speed dial in case it does that again. So, all right, so all of our boats have a 12-volt system. All of them. If they have a battery, they have a 12-volt system. Some of them might also be 24, 36, 48. Actually, does anybody here have a boat that is not 12 volts? That's some kind of 24, 36, or 48? Probably not. Yeah. They're not very common. The only time you're really going to see 48 is for electric propulsion. And the house systems are still going to be 12 volts. You can have, in some cases, you can have 120 volts. Usually it's something you're going to see on the larger boats. You can also have USB very, very easily, because USB is basically 5 volts DC. Hold on to that thought, we'll come back to it. Oh, So I went too quick here. All right. One quick note regarding the outlets we will use on boats, and that's where the standards get very interesting. They mentioned that we should use these outlets. Anybody recognize that outlet on the left? It's a GFCI. We use them in washrooms, we use them in kitchens, basically any kind of wet environment. The standards say we should use them anywhere on the boat which is a wet environment. My personal interpretation is the entire boat is a wet environment, and I use them everywhere. In the boat, they're about probably 20 bucks each, which in boat world is peanuts. So I just use them everywhere. Now, amperage. That is one thing you will want to understand as well as possible if you want to design, maintain, and troubleshoot your electric systems, because it actually plays a very large part. So it describes the intensity of the current being provided. Let's forget 120 volt, let's focus on 12 volts. The amps are telling you how much current is being used. So if you have a light that is using 1 amp, and you have a light that's using 2, well, the one that's using 2 is using twice as much current. It's going to draw the power out of your batteries twice as fast, and the wire is going to have to support twice as much current. And again, spoiler alert, the LEDs will draw a lot less amperage for the same amount of light that it can generate, which is why they're so handy. Now, the watts, we do use them, but what we also use is amp hours. So amp hours are used to describe, often in batteries or even different systems, how much they draw. Because your battery can provide maybe 500 amps, 2 amps, maybe 1,000 amps. Get a double lock cable running from the positive to the negative. You're going to get a few thousand amps right there in a very exciting situation for a few seconds. Now, what's interesting is what we call the amp hours. So that's the amount of power from a sustained perspective it can deliver. So a lot of the batteries, the marine batteries, the deep cycle batteries, will be 100 amp hours. Some might be a bit more, some might be a bit less, but a lot of them are right around that. What that means is that they can provide 100 amps for an hour, or 1 amp for 100 hours, or whichever way we split it down. That's the capacity they have. Now, that's in theory. The reality is that they can deliver a whole lot less. We're going to see that in details because that changes depending on the type of batteries. So we have an example there. So a battery that can provide 100 amp hours can provide 100 amps for 1 hour, as we had mentioned. So a light drawing 1 amp will draw 1 amp per hour if it's on the whole time. Now, for example, if you have a fridge that says it's drawing, I don't know, 10 amps, how much is it drawing per hour? Well, it depends how often it's running. So that's where sometimes it gets very complicated. You might have a device, if it's a light, it's easy. Whenever it's on, it's drawing. But if you have different items, for example, I might have a compressor that might be more complex, that might be going through cycles, that's where you're going to need a battery monitor to really know how much it's pulling, because you want your wire to be able to sustain that, but how much power it's going to use on a period of time will depend on, for example, fridges, how well it's insulated, how big the fridge is, how hot is it outside. So group exercise, they're always fun. So a vessel has an anchor light which draws 1 amp. The captain turns it on at 10 p.m. and off at 8 a.m. So we have it running for 10 hours. How many amp hours did you draw from the battery if that's drawing 1 amp for 10 hours? Yeah, 10 amp hours. Looks like nothing, but it really does add up. Now, wattage, important to understand because when you look at solar panels, they're always going to be listed in watts. So volts times amps gives you watts. Why is that important to know? Because solar panels do not run on 12 volts. Thankfully, we have solar controllers that can do the conversion. Shore charger is another example. Let's say we have shore power. Well, it's going to take 120 volts, turn it into 12 volts, giving us much less voltage, but a lot more amperage, because the same watts are being carried throughout, potentially. If we have an inverter, what is an inverter? We'll see that later. It takes 12 volts to create 120 volts. You will need some really big batteries and some really big cables, because to go from To go from 12 to 120, we all agree we have to multiply by 10. So if you have something taking 10 amps, which is very reasonable on 120 volts, well, it's going to take you at least 100 on 12 volts to reach the same level of power. So if we have a 12 volt device that has a power rating of 120 watts, how much amps is it drawing? Knowing that volts times amps equals watts. So if we have 120 watts, so 12 times 10, exactly. So in that case, we have something that's drawing 10 amps. Now, you don't necessarily need to be expert in the specifics, you just need to understand the general concepts. If that device, which is using 10 amps, runs for 2 hours, how many amp hours have we used? 2 times 10? 20. Any questions so far? Nope. Hold on. All right. Now, series versus parallel. You don't actually, most people will not use series connections when it comes to batteries unless they use 6-volt batteries. The guys that are using 6-volt batteries are probably going like, yeah, of course. And the guys that are using 12 volts battery are probably going like, huh? No problem. If you're using 12-volt batteries, you're going to put them in what we call parallel, because if you have multiple batteries, obviously you want to add power. You're adding power with each battery you add. So if you add them in parallel, basically all the pluses together, all the grounds together, basically positive with positive, ground with ground, you're going to be adding the amps, or the amp hours too. Now if you connect them in series, and those are 12-volt batteries, meaning you're going to go from positive to negative, positive to ground, and ground to positive, it means you're going to be adding voltage, which is why if you're using 12-volt batteries, you're going to be wiring them in parallel. If you're using 6-volt batteries, you're going to be wiring them in series. Now, when it comes to solar panels, you can wire them whichever. Actually, who here is using 6-volt batteries, just out of curiosity, just show of hands? A few people. Is it better? It's just different. Now, battery selection. So we have 2 types of batteries. Before we even get to different chemistry, we have 2 types of batteries for 2 different purposes. We're going to have what we call starting or cranking batteries. Those are basically car batteries. That's what they do. You're going to have some that are rated for marine. The only difference, from what I understand, is that the temperature at which they calculate the cranking amps is different, because you'll have marine cranking amps versus cold cranking amps. How does it matter? It does not. You can use a car battery as a starter. That is absolutely fine, not a problem. Now, what you don't want to do is use a car battery for your deep cycle. That's your house bank. You want to use a dedicated battery. Some of them will be called dual purpose, which maybe not so bad, but you definitely don't want to use a starting or cranking battery for your house. You could run it, well, first, it's not going to work very well. The battery could die soon, and you could end up with unforeseen excitement. They're not meant to handle that kind of stuff, and you could get exciting adventures and chemistry running a little afoul on you. Usually, starting or cranking batteries will have a rating in cold cranking amps, because nobody cares how long they can sustain. Their job is not to sustain. Their job is to give a big boost, a big push. Deep cycles, they will be rated in amp hours. As we mentioned, one of the most common sizes is going to be probably around 100. If they're small, maybe around 80 something, maybe a little 120, but that's usually for standard size. Starting or cranking batteries should always be lead acid. We will not use lithium batteries as starters. It's bad for the batteries. It's completely unneeded. We just don't do that. Lithium batteries are only for your house loads. Now, lead acid, pros and cons. So pros, they're cheap. They're cheap. To buy, they are the cheapest. And you can find them everywhere. Canadian Tire, Costco. I used to buy mine, I think. I bought some at Canadian Tire and some others at Costco. No problem. They're basically car batteries. Just make sure you get them the right size. Keep in mind, a diesel might require a little bit more power than a small car. So you want to make sure you get one that has enough power, but otherwise they're the same thing. The cons, They're very, very heavy. Lead, acid, they're literally mostly lead, with a little bit of acid in there. They have a higher self-discharge rate. What does that mean? They will discharge by just looking at them, basically. Just time will cause them to degrade. It's due to their chemistry. And lose charge. Requires maintenance by adding distilled water. So I'm not sure if you might or might not know that. Who here has ever entered their boat and got a bit of a smell like, smells like my batteries have gotten a little active there. So sometimes they might boil a little bit. If you get in there and it really smells like rotten eggs, you might have a problem. But even in natural function, they will lose a little bit of that water. Hence why it's very important to keep them in boxes, because you want that to stay contained or vented, but you don't want it to just pool somewhere it shouldn't. So as we mentioned, the covered battery box is a good idea. And also, they have a lower usable amp hour rating. What does that mean? Is that you can really only use about 50% of the capacity. So if you have a battery rated at 100 amp hours, for example, you could use all 100. It will work not so well near the end, and your battery will not love you very long. It's going to die very, very quick. So that's for lead acid. Lead acid also can be available in sealed or AGM. A lot of the same concepts apply. The difference is, one of the big differences is that you don't need to add water. They're sealed, so they're not going to lose under normal function. They still have valves that can, in case of emergency, leak out, because we don't want them to explode. But in normal operation, they should not lose liquid, and you will not need to add liquid. So that's one of the benefits. They are maintenance-free. But otherwise, they share a lot of the same drawbacks. They're still the same kind of weight and all that. Now, lithium. Sometimes lithium gets bad publicity. Every once in a while, you'll see an article about some boat that exploded or burnt down because of lithium batteries. And they're usually some kind of lithium ion, which is not lithium iron phosphate. All the ones you will see for sale in the marine world are lithium iron phosphate. They are perfectly safe. I'm not saying they're right for you. They're right for some people. They're wrong for others. What they do not do is self-combust. They don't do that. You could punch a hole through them. You're not going to get a fire. Now, obviously, some lithium technologies can do that. Not these. So the pros, they're a lot lighter. They're actually very light. You might be looking at 20 to 30% of the weight only. So whatever would be probably 60 pounds of lead acid, you might be looking at maybe 15, 20. So very, very light. Who here has lithium already, actually, just by show of hands? I know, I put them on your boat. Now, who else has lithium? Cool. Just kind of curious to see what people have. So they have a very low to almost non-existent self-discharge rate, meaning that if they're full in the fall, they're still full in the spring. You can't say that. I'm not sure if you guys ever experienced that with your lead acids. Like, hey, they're full and then they're lower. What happened? Lead acid will self-discharge. Lithium's very little. There is no maintenance required. There's no water to get in or out. They got a higher usable amount of amp hours. So what that means is that if we take, for example, the 100 amp hours under lead acid, you can only use half of that without damaging your battery. You could once in a while go lower, but not repeatedly. These are rated to go as low as 20%. You always want to follow your manufacturer's recommendation, but generally it's 20% what they're rated for. So what that means is that if you get 100 amp hours of lithium, you can use 80. If you get 100 amp hours of lead acid, you can use 50. Obviously, still, same caveat applies. You could use the remaining 20%, kind of at your own risk. The battery will not really enjoy the experience and will not last quite as long. Potentially very, very long battery life. A lot of them are rated for 2,000 to 4,000 cycles. Will they really last that long? Because technically speaking, we might be putting them on our wills if we follow that. 2,000 to 4,000 cycles is decades of use. They haven't been around for decades, so who knows exactly how long they're going to last, but they should last a while, much longer than lead acids. The cons, they are more expensive, but they... Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. Yeah, lithium allows you to do interesting things. like run air fryers. That's something that was a bit of a running gag in a solo, and I'm routinely running an air fryer aboard. Lithium will allow you to do that. Do not try that at home with lead acids. Lithium allows you to do interesting things, let's put it that way. And yes, I do have a freezer just for ice cream. Again, lithium is interesting. So they're a bit more expensive, but they're coming down in price. They're not drop-in. Also, you're going to see that drop-in lithium batteries. They're not drop-in. You're going to have to change a few things. You're going to need to add specific fuses for safety, because when these things decide to give you a short, they can give you a real good short. They need a fuse basically that's rated to handle up to 20,000 amps. Because what could happen is if you have a regular fuse which is not meant to handle that, it can fuse itself shut. So instead of blowing, it will melt. And the molten metal will create a solid contact. Not a good situation. Also, they cannot be charged below freezing. Not a real big concern here, but people that have tiny homes or stuff like that, that can be a concern. Some of them will have heaters built in, and that automatically, when there's a charge coming in, they're going to use that charge to bring themselves at temperature and maintain themselves at temperature. And only once they reach a safe charging temperature will they start recharging. Obviously not much of a concern for us, but if you guys also, actually who here has campers, tiny homes, or things like that? So, cool stuff. So yeah, lithium, a bit more complicated in those cases. I don't think any of us are sailing when it's below freezing. We wish we could, but I'm still trying to petition, if you guys want to help me to get a series of bubblers going. I was thinking from CVGR, but maybe we can do from Nepean to Penny's all bubblers, so we can do it all season. If you guys are in, let's do a petition. Let's get our tax dollars to work. Let's get just a series of bubblers, 12 months of sailing. Oh. All right, I guess we're not going to count on your support. All right, now we have an interesting case study here to do a comparison, because they're more expensive, but they last longer, and also you have a higher usable capacity, so it's kind of tricky to see, are they cheaper? And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. It really depends on usage. So here, we're assuming we're designing a brand new system, so we don't have any other complications. We don't have to change the charger or any of those things, because everything needs to be compatible with lithium. When you go lithium drop-in, it is not. Let's assume there's no cost or anything. We're just looking at the batteries themselves, which is not a real scenario. You're going to have additional costs when you convert to lithium. You're going to have to change a whole lot of things. But just looking at batteries themselves. So we looked at two batteries. So that's the example I had from last year. The reason I picked those is because I have them, so I know them very well. Not an endorsement or anything. If I was to buy them again, not that I'm not happy with them, I'm very happy, but now we have other options that are a little bit cheaper, I would choose something different. So these, just for the purpose of the exercise, are 170 amp hours each. They still weigh less than a standard lead acid that's only about 100 amp hours. They weigh 50 pounds. So by lead acid standards, not too bad. Usable capacity, keep in mind we can discharge them down to 20%. So at 170, we have 136 usable. Cost per unit is $871. There'll be a quiz on that later, just kidding though. There's a lot of them. This one is just purely for example. So we have one, again, because it's comparable in amp hours with a whole bunch of them, just for purely for example, not that there's anything right or wrong with these. So these are 220 amp hours, so heavyweights. They're going to be big, they're going to be heavy, actually 120 pounds. Definitely bigger than your average. And they're going to give you a usable capacity of 110 amp hours. And you can see right there the comparison in the usable capacity for the weight. This one gives you a usable capacity just per battery of 136, and it weighs about 50 pounds. This one is at 120 pounds, and it's lower. So from a weight perspective, it's extremely helpful. For example, on mine, they're all on port, and that's not too much of an issue. I wouldn't try that with these monsters. First, I wouldn't have room to put them, and even then, I'd have a bit of a list to one side, because if I was to add basically close to 500 pounds to one side, I might notice it. Please sit on this side, passengers. Now, if we put it all together, because to have a bank, right? Because we never have just one. I'm going to have one so big, I'm going to not have a bank. I'm going to have one massive battery. They're actually available, some manufacturers. You can get some that are absolutely huge. Some, I'm not sure if you've ever seen them, literally on wheels. Not something we would use for a boat, but you can get some pretty scary stuff. Now let's take a look at the overall bank, because that's what really tells the story. It's not really the batteries themselves, but once you put it together. So if we build a bank, which is very similar, here we have a usable capacity of 408. Here we have a usable capacity of 440. So a little bit higher on this side, but still kind of similar. Our first bank weighs about 150 pounds for lithium. A comparable and slightly more capacity in lead acid is at 480 pounds, almost 500 pounds. That is over 3 times heavier. The cost is almost the same. Actually, that's an update I did. This was from last year's deck, but I updated because the price actually went down. The price for lead acid, I think, were about the same, if I recall, but the lithium went down a bit. And again, now they have more manufacturers with even cheaper products, some of them which can be pretty good. So about the same prices, slightly more expensive for the lithium, slightly less usable capacity, a lot less weight. But the cycles, so usually a deep cycle might give you maybe about 500 cycles, maybe 5 years of use, maybe a little bit more if you take really good care of it. The problem is that very often we forget to add water, and then they dry up. They don't really last very long. That's the biggest problem that these have. These are not AGMs. If they were sealed AGMs, you would see they would actually be probably more expensive than the lithiums. And the lithiums, we have life cycles, maybe 2,000, but I don't know, ask me again in 20 years how long my batteries have lasted. Any questions on batteries before we move on to switches? And again, lithium, good for some people, not necessarily good for everybody. Yes?
What's the most modest size lithium battery?
That's a very good question you bring up. So the standard capacity would be about 100 amp hours. Some might be a bit less, some might be a bit more. Your 100 amp hour lithium is going to be a lot smaller than 100 amp hour of lead acid. Also, it does not need a container. It does not need to be in a sealed box. So I'm not sure if you guys ever experienced that. You buy a boat, you want to do things right, your surveyor tells you it has to be in a box. Who else has had that experience? They did surveyor, it has to be in a box. I got told. I think probably some people here got told that. So yeah, it should be in the box. And then you get to your boat, which was never designed for boxes. You have one for start, you have one for deep cycle, you put one battery box in there, you're all proud, and then you try to get the other battery box in there, and it doesn't fit. There's no way it fits because it was never designed for that. So you're saving space because you don't need that battery box, and the batteries themselves are actually smaller. I would say, you know, a standard deep cycle is probably, Again, I'm very bad mime, like I'm still learning. But if you're looking at a lithium, you're probably looking at about yay high, probably, again, a very poor description on my part. I'll try to mime it better for next year. But they're actually significantly smaller as well. To go back to the example here, I did not write down the size, but take my word for it, those lithiums are actually smaller. Those are the ones I have, actually. And they are literally they're fairly tall. They're about yay thick, about that wide, and about this tall for 170 amp hour. So for those that are used to handling batteries, that's a lot of power in a format that's not too big. Also, because you don't need boxes, you can go with all kinds of exotic sizes, some of them that don't even have boxes for, which is just fine. They just need to be tied down, and you need to have some kind of way to make sure you don't have anything dropping on the positive and negative sides. But yeah, very good question. They are actually literally smaller, not just lighter. Again, how much smaller? It really depends on the manufacturers. Now, using the main battery switch. So back in the day, we had, which a lot of the boats still have, there was a 1, 2, or all. Sometimes you're going to see 1 + 2 or all, it's the same thing. So basically, it was a 1, 2 switch. Now, with the modern technology, not so much. I think it's more not the technology that's changing, but the culture that's changing. We have on-off switches, which I love. Obviously, you can have two types of battery banks. You can have a house and a start. And your switches, they might, depending on the manufacturer and the era, they might look a little different. But basically, all those three are different manufacturers, but they're the same switch. They're a 1, 2, all, or 1 plus 2, same thing. I hate those with lithium. Why do I hate those with lithium? It has to do with how they're used. So one, and it doesn't matter what's 1 or what's 2. You're going to assign one as a house. You're going to assign one as a start. But really, none of them are dedicated. When you put it to 1, everything is fed from 1. Your starter is fed from 1. Your electronics are fed from 1. Your lights are fed from 1, so on and so forth. You put it to 2, it's the same story. You cannot have one doing one thing, the other doing something else. You just pick a bank, it does everything. Pick another, it does everything. And what some people do is that, I'm just going to use all. And then they drain all, and then they're in the dark at 3 in the morning at Penny's, and then the next morning they're not able to start the engine, and an argument ensues. I'm not sure if it ever happened to anybody here. I don't wish that to my worst enemy. Probably the argument more than the actual running out of battery. Now, the reason why it's so bad for lithium is that you do not want to start your engine with a lithium battery. It's bad for the battery. As much as they're really good, they're not good at giving you tons and tons and tons of amps, boom, just like that. They're really good at give you a lot of amps sustained, but not a ton, because they're deep cycle batteries, let's not forget that. They're not good at giving you, basically, to use technical terms, a shit ton of power in a very small amount of time. So you don't want to use them for that. On top of that, they are really good at sucking power. If you have a charger connected to them, they will take that power. The problem is if it's connected to your alternator, they can literally burn down your alternator. Gimme, 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 to the point your alternator will overheat, and that can happen. Also, if they have what we call a BMS, battery management system, because they're all some level of smart batteries. So there's basically a mini computer in them. If it sees that something is going funky, it will disconnect. Who here knows what happens when you disconnect an alternator under load? It fries. So you could fry your batteries, you could fry your alternator, you could fry a whole lot of things. All that to say that you do not want your, unless you have an alternator which has an external regulator, which is basically designed and optimized for lithium, which most people do not have, you don't want your alternator to, or your starter to interface with your lithium battery.
Eric,
Yes.
good question. On occasion, in an emergency, you could start your engine with the lithium?
Yes.
They would replace
You could do that. How much they would complain and how much they would be uncomfortable is kind of on a case-by-case basis. It also depends how big your bank is, because the bigger your bank is, the least bad it is. Like if you're asking, can one man lift an elephant? Not so much. But eventually you'll get enough that maybe they won't get crushed. It's kind of like the same idea. The bigger your bank, the less the potential concern, because it could be really hard on the BMS, which is the internal computer, which can be replaced, though depending on the battery, you might have to basically tear it apart, and then what do you have? No box anyway. It gets complicated. But yes, if you, and that's a very good question. If you have the choice between not starting your engine and starting it with your lithiums, of course you're going to start it with your lithiums. I've seen a lot of people starting their engine with their lithiums just out of using those switches and not realize the mistakes they've made. So let's say, for example, 1 is your start, 2 is your house. You're running everything on 2, you're not thinking you're starting your engine. You just hurt your lithiums. They're not going to tell you right now, but they might tell you in a few years. Those 2,000 cycles, you're probably not going to see those. Same thing if you started on 2, you even started on 1, you started on whatever it is. And then you're on your house bank, which is your lithiums, and your alternator is running. Something happens for whatever reason, your batteries are like, I don't want any of that, I don't want that. I'm just going to opt out of whatever's going on, and your battery management system shuts down. You just grilled your alternator. So with lithiums, I really don't like those because it's very, very tricky. You have to basically be, and if you want to put it to all, that's another problem with lithiums because they're not exactly the same voltage. And you could have, again, kind of like the same principle as when if you were to try to start the engine with it, is that your lead acid, especially if it's depleted, is going to be a lower voltage, so it's going to want to shoot all of that to your lead acid. So the all setting is not very good. It's basically, I don't like those with lithium. I don't think they should be used with lithium. Anytime I do a lithium conversion, I strongly, strongly recommend, almost force the customer to go to change their battery switch. I'm like, you could, it's just a really bad idea. And the reason for that, you're going to be in the wrong setting in a bunch of times.
So basically, we put 2 single switches on off.
No, you don't have to. But great intro to the next slide. Hold that thought, because it's a very good one. So basically, the 1-2 switches, we have 2 inputs. How many outputs do we have? Just one. Whatever you want to use as your house is going to do your start, whatever it's on. Whatever you want to use as your start, whenever you start your engine, is going to basically feed everything else on the boat, because there's only one output. So really, they're not really dedicated. You're going to have one which is preferred as a start, and you're going to have one that's preferred as a house. In some cases, they might be the exact same battery. I've seen it sometimes. Someone might have a dual purpose, and which is fine. You could also, let's say you have a small boat, then you only have them for redundancy. So when one is out, you have a backup. Nothing wrong with that. You're not going to see that with larger boats with large electric system, but a basic boat, that's absolutely fine. Better than just one, you have a backup at least. So the cons, it requires a lot of micromanagement, especially if you have lithium. You can deplete one or both banks unknowingly, especially if you leave it to all. Let's say you were running your alternator, you put it to all, I'm going to charge everything, forget to put it back to 1 or 2, drain everything. I've seen that very often. I've seen that with some people that have lithium. Oh, no, please, why are people doing that? But it happens. Your battery banks, we said, they're not dedicated. Also, and then you have to do a lot of switching, right? Because you have to go from 1 to 2, 1 to 2 to all, depending on if you want to start your engine, if you want to recharge one or recharge the other. If at any point you go to off, do not collect go. Well, I messed that one. I wanted to do a great Monopoly joke. But anyway, do not pass go, do not collect $200. That's what I was going for. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so that's bad idea. And you can damage, as mentioned, batteries, alternator, everything if using lithium. Even non-lithium, I'm not a fan of those. I'm not saying you have to replace them. But if you're doing a full upgrade, consider the newer switches. Now, the main difference with those, we do have an emergency combiner. Some of them might not. It's a good idea to have it, just if nothing else works. The big difference is that we have 2 inputs, same as the other one, but we also have 2 outputs, which is the biggest difference, which means your house is your house. Your start is your start. That's it. You do not need to switch it from 1 to 2, to go to all when you want to charge. Start is start, house is house. What does that mean, though? Which one does the alternator connect to? Start. So if you want, for some reason, and there's a lot of really good reasons for that, want to charge your house with your alternator, you're going to need some extras. That's the downside to it. You could use the all setting, but there's better ways. What are those better ways? These things. So one is what we call a battery combiner. What it does is that when a charge is being detected, it combines your battery. Imagine you have someone in your battery compartment, little minion, that every time there's a charge, he puts it to all. The moment the charge is gone, brings it back to separate. That's what it does. It parallels them when there's a charge present. You also have your battery isolator. What it does is that it will not parallel them. It will not join them together. As the name says, isolates. So it keeps them isolated. What it does is it takes the power being generated by your alternator and gives it to both banks without paralleling them. So this one will parallel them. Basically, like if you're putting your switch to all, this one keeps them dedicated, but charges both. The old isolators were real bad, and they would steal a lot of voltage. The new ones, pretty good. So if you have an old one, maybe consider replacing. These do not work with lithium batteries because they have different charge profiles. I do believe Victron might have an isolator that might be compatible with lithium, but that's a lot of ifs, and I'd want to look into it further before I recommend it to anybody. But I've seen something that I think might be able to do lithium. But the challenge with lithium is that you need different charge profiles, because a lithium charger does not operate on the same algorithms or the same voltage as a lead-acid charger. So that's the challenge there. Any questions on these? How much? Very nice. How much? For those that like Borat. They're not, the ACR is the cheapest. I believe it's around 100, maybe a bit less. The isolator is a bit more. The isolator, I believe, could be probably around 150 or 160, so feel free to double check on Amazon or something like that. I might be a little bit off. I don't install them too often. Actually, I've installed one. It was customer provided, so I haven't had to shop for them a whole lot. And if you're doing lithium, which a lot of people that hire me will do, it's a no-go for both of those options. What you can do is you can use what's called a DC to DC charger. Think of it as a shore power charger, but instead of taking 120 to give you 12 volts, it's taking 12 volts to give you 12 volts. And you're probably like, can I just do that with just a wire? But the problem is that you can't just parallel lithium to lead acid. You need an actual charger because it's different charging algorithms and different voltage. So you need the actual DC to DC charger to take 12 volts and present it to your battery in a way that will be optimal for it. Yes?
How much do they weigh?
They're very light, both of them. The ACR is super light, and you guys have one. I remember seeing it. The ACR is very, well, probably yay big, very light. The isolator is a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, but none of them are that big or that heavy.
Any local providers for all the stuff?
Chandlery will have everything you need, and they're awesome, and I highly recommend them. Chandlery will have all of that. They're the best local provider. They have my stamp of approval. Yes?
Do you have a preference for which one you recommend if you were?
And again, they're both perfectly acceptable. So as a technician, I would say they're both fine. As a sailor, my preference would be for the isolator. Because then I keep both banks completely separate. I keep both banks completely independent. And then I just end up charging both. I prefer that, but it's not so much an expert opinion as a personal opinion, because they're both perfectly acceptable. They've been on the market for some time, and they're both pretty good. The isolators used to be somewhat less popular because the older models stole a lot of voltage to the diodes, but the newer ones don't seem to have that problem as much. Hopefully that answers the question. So they're both very good. I personally have a slight preference for isolators. Though keep in mind, if you do have lithium, or if you plan on going with lithium, neither of those options are good ideas.
So how do you charge your lithium?
That's a DC to DC charger. So basically same as a shore power charger, but instead of taking 120 to give you 12 volts, it's going to take 12 volts to give you 12 volts, which seems redundant, but it needs to take the 12 volts and be able to deliver it in a way that your lithium battery will be able to appreciate it. Because it's different chemistry, different algorithms, and different charging voltages. Did everybody understand that one? So how, if you have lithium, can you charge one from the other? One of the ways, you could have an external regulator for your alternator to do that, or one other way is simply to have what we call a DC to DC charger. Think of it as a shore power charger, but powered by 12 volts. So basically, you plug it to any 12-volt source. It doesn't matter what the source is. What matters is the output. So if you want to charge a lithium, go on its settings, lithium, this, that, and it will know the proper algorithms and the proper voltages and deliver that to the battery in a way that will be optimal. Because if you try to just parallel lithium and lead acid, it will not work well. They're completely different voltages. To give you an idea, we call them 12-volt batteries, but lithium's actually run on 14 volts. It's fine for your electronics, but if you're trying to charge it, like, imagine how far your charging algorithms are, because it's not even the right voltage. It's not even close to being the right voltage.
I think they delivered 12.7.
Hmm?
In US, it's 12.7.
Yeah, 12.7, 12.8 for lead acid, and your lithiums are, I think, 14.4. So.
I
Yeah, on the lead acid, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Fully charged lead acid will be around that, 12.7 to 12.8, depending on the temperature. Yeah. Sorry?
That's the nominal voltage, 3.7. So when you say 12 to 12, it's really, if you have 12 volts, you need to charge it like 14.1 or 13.7.
Yeah.
So it's not 12 to 12, but it's like 12.2, and you need to have the output at.
Exactly, exactly. So it's not just taking it, it's the. Oh, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, voltage times amperage equals wattage, because it's going to have to do is it's going to have to increase the voltage of one to be able to deliver properly to the other, and also sends the other one to see when it needs it, how much it needs it, when to give it, when not to give it, and then upvolt it by taking some of the amperage, transform it to the higher voltage that the battery is going to be able to handle. Now, do you understand all of that? No, not simply that if they're different chemistries, you're going to need a charger between them. You can't just wire them together. That's basically the gist of it. So we have a question, actually, which was a very good question that was submitted online to Facebook. So the customer had a Yamaha 9.9 outboard and 2 batteries starting in the house, and they were using the old style, just like that, a 1-2 switch, which we remember, 2 inputs, 1 output. So they want, very wisely, to go, and they do not have lithium. They just want to make their life easier. We have enough stress in our life. We don't need to be messing around with the switch. I actually changed my switch before I went to lithium. I've changed to one of those just for the efficiency and the simplicity. So they want to go with one of those, and the question is, and they're going to use an isolator, so basically making sure, so this person has done their homework. They've picked the right switch. They've identified that they need an isolator if they want to charge both the house and the start, which is a good idea. You generally want to charge your house. In my case, I don't charge my house, but that's because my alternator is garbage. It's a gasoline engine, so I'm not running it unless I have to. And I have solar panels, so I don't care, but most people will care. So the question, how can I use the house to start the engine? And keep in mind, it's not a lithium, so that is not a problem whatsoever. Well, you can't. That's the unfortunate thing with those. If you wanted, there's different ways to do that. You can use the combine, which is basically your emergency setting. However, that will put both batteries together. If you have one, which is, let's say your house is full and your start is almost empty, it's not optimal because your house, before even trying to start your engine, is going to try to charge your start. So basically, it has to try to start your engine and has to also try to share its power with the start. So you're not helping it in any way, shape, or form. If both of them are kind of in the middle of the way, putting them together, you're going to have more power. But if one is stopped and the other one is very low, not a good idea. So in that case, if the customer really, really, truly wanted to use the house, what they would have to do, there's the very manual way, and there's the more, I guess, preventative setup way. If someone wanted to retain that capability, they would need to install probably a mini switch, a disconnect on their start. So what that means, they would need an extra switch before the switch. Directly on their start, basically between their start and this switch, so they can turn it on and off. And then when they use the all feature, really they're just pulling from the house. Or if someone was to find themselves in that situation, just disconnect the start. And then use the all settings, because at that point, you've disconnected your start, and you're using, you basically, by putting it to all, you're saying that everything is going to go everywhere, and you remove the start from your equation, so then you're using your house to power everything. So you would need to disconnect the start or have a switch already connected to allow you to disconnect your start. That would be the 2 ways to do it. Other than that, there is no way, if you have one of those, to manually start with the house because they're dedicated. You're already doing that. When you use the combined batteries, you're putting everything together. That's the all setting. So it looks very like you have a big warning sign there because they're not necessarily meant for that. If you go for one of those, it's not to put it to all. It's so that you can have them dedicated. But yeah, that is the all setting. Basically, this setting right here is the same setting as this setting. They do the exact same thing. It's just that here, they assume that you have an isolator or a battery combiner, and you're probably not going to use that setting in normal operation. That's why there's a little bit of a warning sign there. But really, it's the all feature.
So in that case, if you have the disconnect, that's what you want. You put it into the all, and then we'll turn on the disconnect to
Yeah.
the other battery bank.
Yes.
Switch to the all.
Yes. Yeah. So if you wanted, let's say you were like a mad tinkerer and you wanted to be in absolute control of your battery system at all times, which is not necessarily a bad idea, you could literally have a disconnect coming out of each battery and be able to just turn one or off, and then you could have everything from the start or everything from the house. And these would not necessarily need to be all that accessible because they would not be emergency controls. They would be more like advanced settings. So they could be under like behind a SETI, they could be inside where the battery compartment is. You want, obviously, your main battery switch to be accessible, but these could be tucked away very easily. If someone wanted to do that for maximum control, they could do that. Now, the thing that I think is very unlikely to see that, because the kind of user that would want to do that is probably comfortable enough to just disconnect whichever one he doesn't want to use at that time. So that's why I don't really see it happening, but that's how you would do it. Now, real quick, we're not going to cover how to install inverters and all that, but just to mention them really briefly, if you want to have 120 volts when you're not connected to the grid, you need one of those. You need an inverter. There's a bunch of different manufacturers. They're fairly heavy. They're expensive. They're big. They require very, very big cables, but they allow you 120 volts off the dock, which is the secret ingredients to running an air fryer at Penny's. Yeah. They will run off anything. Very good question, though, that you bring. So they will run off anything. There is no problem with any of the electronics running on the higher voltage you're going to get from lithium. However, very often inverters are what we call inverter chargers, meaning they will do both features, because why not? It also gives you auto switching, so if you connect and disconnect from the grid, you don't lose power. You want to make sure that that charger is compatible lithium. Any inverter will take lithium. Any device that pulls from your battery is not going to care if it's lithium. Actually, it might be quite pleased because it's probably going to get a lot of power. But anything that charges needs to be lithium compatible. How do you know? Most of the new stuff is. Not really any of the old stuff is. However, if you have a battery charger which is compatible, which can be user-defined, where you can choose your voltages and all that, you might be able to configure it for lithium without necessarily having it have a lithium setting. However, those are usually the more modern ones that already have a lithium setting. However, whenever they come up with a new technology, you might be okay even if you're not specifically compatible with it. Energy-saving tips, as I mentioned, is basically a few slides to tell you about the benefits of LEDs. Your number one, unless you have a fridge, your number one use of power is going to be lights. Sometimes in ways that you might not even think about. So typical incandescent light bulb on our boats might pull about 1 amp. From what I've looked at, it seems to be about the standard. So that works out to be about 12 watts. So not a powerful light. 12 watts, we had that at home. That's nothing, right? In terms of incandescent, it won't even light up a room. In some cases, it could be much higher. So in that scenario, so if we have 4 cabin lights for 4 hours, so 4 times 4, that's 16. All right, 16 amps. An anchor light for 10 hours, that's already 26 amps. So if we have, let's say, a small to medium-sized boat, we probably only have a single house battery. It's probably about 100 amp hours, which only half of it is usable. So we're down to 50 amp hours. And just to be at anchor for the night and 4 hours of light, we've already used half of our battery. We haven't recharged a cell phone. We haven't turned on our nav lights. We haven't used our electronics or anything. We've just used lights for 4 hours and had our anchor light because we don't want someone in a jet ski to run into us. I don't know what kind of nightmares you have, but these are the ones I have. LEDs will often drop to 3 to 4 times less, sometimes much, much less than that. So basically, do yourself a favor. Anybody that is thinking, what can I do to make my batteries last longer? What can I do to extend my range? The first thing you should always do is every single light on your boat, change it to an LED. With the one only potential exception being your steaming light. Because it's only on when your engine is running, and if your engine is running, you might not care all that much. However, I would probably change everything to LED just the same. One quick note in there, LEDs are polarity sensitive. Does someone know what polarity sensitive means? I see one person going, oh. You've installed LEDs, have you? Mark, you've installed LEDs, have you?
Yes, it is.
And that's probably where you learned where polarity meant, right?
Exactly. The first LED I installed was on a steaming light.
Yeah. Oh, that must have been fun. So let me guess, an April install and a June surprise. Yeah. So back in the day, they used incandescent light bulbs. Incandescent light bulbs is basically what was invented by Mr. Edison, or knowing Mr. Edison, probably something he copied from someone else. However, it is very straightforward. You have electricity that is going to a filament, creating resistance, in the process creating a whole lot of heat and a tiny little bit of light too. It doesn't matter which side the electricity comes through because you have a filament. The resistance creates heat, creates light. It can go one way, it can go the other. Some of the older boats, actually, the wires are not even color-coded. On mine, everything was black. They didn't care. Doesn't matter. However, when we go in there to install LEDs, half of them are wired in reverse. Which should be the positive is negative, which should be negative is the positive. It doesn't matter in incandescent light bulbs because it goes from one side. Like, it doesn't matter if the positive comes from here or here. It's going to travel and it's going to light up this wonderful little thing. But an LED is actually using diodes, which are polarity sensitive. And if you plug them in reverse, they will not work. They're basically a more advanced circuit. Yes?
There's lots of light bulbs out there that say they're not polarity sensitive. Do they work as well?
LEDs?
Yeah. No, the one in the house, so Eric?
Yes.
I put LED bulbs in my boat last year. It didn't matter which way they went around because these were designed actually to be.
Oh.
They have
Oh.
They have a rectifier bridge.
I'm very interested and curious because I was not aware of that. Thank you for letting me know. So sometimes, you know, you guys learn, sometimes I learn. I was not aware that they had those. I will definitely have to look into that. Because, yeah, it was the bane of our existence. Every time we changed LEDs, half the lights worked, the other half didn't work. A lot of them still are not. I'm very interested, I'm very curious. I'll have to look at the prices and all that to see how it compares. Because I was, until about 5 seconds ago, not aware that these were available. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, so they must have a rectifier bridge. So,
Yeah,
so the circuit has 4 more diodes.
probably.
The
Yeah,
LED
yes.
just lights up.
I think the way they designed these ones is there are actually 2 strings of LEDs, one going one way, one going the other way.
Yeah, that could be it. That would be one way to do it. That would be the FIT method.
So it wouldn't fry the bulb, you just rewire.
Yeah, yeah. It's said that it could damage. I've never seen one get damaged. I've seen it mentioned that it could. I've never run into that, and I've wired, well, very often. Well, actually, let me be purely honest. When I was first starting and I was not a pro, I was sometimes stupid and not looking carefully. And also on my boat and other customers' boats, sometimes you do everything right and it's actually wired wrong. Sometimes it's because, you know, if you're installing a light fixture, well, it's your fault. You should have used the multimeter. It doesn't matter if boat wires are black. Like, do your due diligence. But very often you're going to have a light fixture already installed and you just want to change the bulb and you put it in and it doesn't work. That's where you get the meter out. Like, so yeah, if some are compatible with either, that's very good news. I'd be curious to look at the price to see whichever one comes cheaper. But it's probably cheaper than to get me to rewire it. No, let's be honest.
On a DC bulb then, which is the positive polarity? Is it the bread's or the button on the bottom?
Well, it depends how they are. Some of them are going to have 2 buttons at the bottom. Usually they're not the screw-in type. Because the 120 will be the screw-in types. Usually they're very rare. You're going to see screw-in types for those. Very often there's going to be 2 spots at the bottom. Also, some of them are going to have 1 connector basically at each end. They're going to be like kind of like a, I was going to say diamond shape, but just like pointy tips. I'm French, so sometimes I describe things horribly. So they're going to have those little tips that will anchor. Also, sometimes one of the challenges is that some light bulbs are very common types, and some of them are not so common in LEDs. And I've seen sometimes where people try to jerry-rig it, and it's like, you'll see, for example, like a steaming light, and it's like, is that thing going to hold? Because it's not the right light in the fixture. Sometimes some LEDs are very hard to find. Now, I've actually seen it sometimes where it's cheaper to change the light fixture altogether than try to get the right bulb. I've seen that multiple times, actually. Inverters also, if you have one, make sure it's turned off. And I don't mean just inactive, make sure it's turned off, because they have standby power drain. So even if you're not using it, they will drain your battery. That's basically it. So for energy saving, get LEDs, and if you have an inverter, turn it off when you're not using it. Pretty straightforward. Now, mast wiring, I'm sure that all of our masts look like that with like quintuple spreaders and a beautiful radar. That's actually my summer boat. No, I'm just kidding. I wish I had that. I probably wouldn't be doing marine electrical if I had that. What can go up a mast? Well, a lot of things can go in there. Now, but most interestingly, what I'm interested in is the mast wiring, so the wires that we're going to run through. So we can have lights, so we can have an anchor light all the way at the top. What kind do we want? LED, yes, 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 yes. We might have a deck light. You do not need a deck light. It's really useful to have, but by code or whatever, it's not required. Often is going to be in these units, which are basically dual purpose units. You're going to have your steaming light around the middle-ish of the mast, and then you're going to have a deck light at the bottom. Quite convenient. You obviously need the steaming light. You don't necessarily, as per regulations, need a deck light, but it's cool to have. You might have wind instruments all the way at the top of the mast. And you might have a whole lot of other stuff. You might have VHF. You might also, which basically use the same thing as AIS, same cable. You might have radar, although that's not very common or useful here. I actually know one person that has radar on this river, and he doesn't ever use it. Yes, actually, I was going to say yes, Mr. Magoo, but Marcel is actually a very accomplished sailor. So I have to show him my respect. Now, best practices. So I thought I had an animation here. I kind of spoiled the punch there. So unless specified otherwise by manufacturer, the wires, they can be run directly in the mast. It's not a bad idea to run a conduit. I'm not saying you have to run a conduit, but if you're doing that kind of stuff and you have the time and you have taken it apart in a way that it's easy to do, it is not a bad idea. It's going to make running wires very easily because they're not going to be loosey-goosey around there. You're going to be installing a conduit to work with. If you have any halyards in there, they're not going to get caught. They're not going to bind. So it is a good practice. It's not a requirement, but it's a good idea. Just keep in mind, some wires go all the way at the top, some of them stop in the middle. So if you want to have only a conduit halfway, that's okay. If you want to have a conduit the whole way, that's also okay. But if you want it to make a stop halfway, you'll have to plan that in your setup, either by just poking a hole in it or having 2 half sections, or whichever way you want to go about that. What you don't want to do, and unfortunately I did run into that, it was not the owner's fault, it was some previous soul, it's probably going to rot in hell, I hope, for that sin, is shoot expanding foam in them to prevent them from rattling. Yeah, it happened. The whole first half of the mast all the way to the mid-mast section. Full of expanding foam. Every hour is a billable hour. That was an interesting experience. We ended up having to run a conduit and just literally like hammering it through. That was a fun afternoon. And I was trying to figure out what it was, and I couldn't figure out because it didn't start all at the base of the mast, and you can't really see in the mast, even if you try to get some light in there. I'm not sure if you guys ever tried to look up a mast, but it's like a black hole, like 2 feet in, like reality ceases to exist. So we were trying to figure out, and I couldn't push it through. I'm like, well, I'm going to get a fish, because I thought, I won't even need a fish. I'll just kind of like throw it in there. It's going to find its way. No, try with a fish. I'm like, I don't understand. It's getting caught in something. Bring it out. You don't understand? Bring it out. And then for some reason, I was looking at the mast, and there were like round dots every 4 feet or so. Like, what is that? So I started scratching them. Deeper. It was some kind of like marine text or something, or some little epoxy. I started scratching, because I'm going to get to the bottom of this. What's going on here? And then digging a little bit. It was full of foam. So please don't do that. And if you do, remember, every hour is a billable hour. But yeah, conduits are a very, very good idea. You don't have to, but it's a good idea. Now, that said, most of the times whenever I have anything to do with mast, the problem are the connectors. Not too often did I run into issues where the wires themselves were bad, and even if they were bad, it was just because the humidity and the corrosion that got into them. I don't think I've ever seen, and I'm sure they're out there, but from my experience, I haven't had a case where I had to replace mast inside the wire because it got chafed or damaged. Just personal experience. Connectors, though, they're a very frequent culprit. Choosing the right connector, it depends what it's for. So is it inside the mast or is it outside exposed to the elements? That's going to make a difference because the inside of the mast is pretty well protected. The outside, not so much. If you have a keel-stepped boat, then you don't really care, right? You can have them coming on the side of the mast, very likely coming right through the hull, and then you're going to have them inside, and then it's just like any other piece of wire. In my case, not sure if you guys know what terminal strips are. Mine are just on the little terminal strip. So they're really a strip of little screws, and just screw them down at the beginning and the end of each season, because I don't need it to be weather protected because they're literally inside the boat. If you have a deck-stepped mast, very likely you're going to use some of those connectors. Those are examples of connectors that you could potentially use for a wind instrument. I actually had a customer that had a bad connection, and that's what's always interesting, because when you want to troubleshoot something, you don't necessarily know what the problem is. You just look at different things and like, well, it looks about okay. You look at something else, that looks about okay. And you look at something else, it's like, I don't like this connector. Like, you don't have a way, especially if it's an intermittent problem, which it was, you don't necessarily have a way to know that it's not working. Because it's working most of the time, then there's a bleep and it stops working. But then you look at it, you're like, I don't like that connector. And you just change it and you hope it fixes the problem. And then it looks fixed, and then you let the customer know and you're like, please be fixed, because it's an intermittent problem. So often what happens, the specialist, the mechanic, whoever's going to look at it, and everything's fine. And then you give it to the customer, and 5 seconds later, it's like, Anyway, we were lucky in that case, that fixed the problem. There were some really, really bad. The connections were basically like, if I recall correctly, I think they were trailer connections or something for like a Raymarine. It was, give me the heebie-jeebies. I'm like, let's replace that. And that turned out to fix the problem. So those are different models, but they kind of do pretty much the same thing. They're technically speaking NMEA connectors, but the right type of pin, right type of signal, voltage, and all that. So they were great for that. In some cases, so that's an example of something that would be, for example, inside the mast. And we have example here of electrical, which would be on the deck. So basically, depending on the number of pins you have. These, from my experience, do not last forever. They will last a while. They'll go kaput, and then you'll replace them. You can probably expect maybe about a decade out of them, maybe a bit more. But my experience is those that were installed in the 80s, usually kaput by now. The water gets into it. They start to get corrosion, and then things happen and needs to be replaced. They're boats, basically. But they do work well for their intended purpose for a reasonable span. They do not last forever. I've heard the feedback from some people, and yeah, they'll go bad eventually. In some cases, you could also use, depending on the type of stuff you're working with, if it's inside the mast, You could use just spade connectors, just the ones you put together. That's potentially just fine also, depending on the type of connection you're working with. And if it's for VHF or AIS, you can have specific connectors for that. Don't get creative. There's connectors for that specifically. You may want to make sure you use those for that coax. Power generation, how are we doing for time? Ooh, we're going to try to race through. So power generation, we have a bunch of different things there. If you guys are okay with that, we're going to race through it because I want to get to the interesting part, which is solar. So we have generators, you guys know what they are, we're not going to go through them. We have alternators, you guys know what they are, we're not going to go through them. We have shore chargers, which actually we don't have shore chargers here, so we're going to go right through that. And we have solar. The benefits of solar, you're not going to have any sound or smell. It's automatic, works all the time. It is very environmentally friendly, at least in its usage. The cons, it doesn't charge super fast. It can be impacted by weather, and it requires physical and electrical install. So the two different types of solar panels you can get are flexible or rigid. Which one is best? Depends on what you need, depends on your setup. For some people, it might be easier to install rigid. For rigid, you might need some kind of arch or support. For a flexible, you can install them on a Bimini, you can install them on a Dodger. However, they have to be properly installed because they can flex, but what they can't do is flap in the wind like that, because they will die very, very quickly. And actually, flexible have gotten themselves a really bad reputation, not because they're bad, but because they are improperly installed. So you want to make sure they're well supported and they don't flap around. Size, of course, we all have that kind of room to put solar panels. I'll just cover the whole thing. Now, realistically, we're probably not going to need that much power or be able to generate that much power. And the question is always, how much solar do I need? And the perfect answer to that is, how long is a piece of string? It depends. It really depends. It depends on your usage. It depends. Do you have a fridge? Are you a maniac that decided to run an air fryer and that has a freezer just for ice cream? That will mean you will need a whole lot more power. Kidding aside, one of the biggest factors is a refrigerator. If you don't have one, you need very little. If you have one, you need a fair amount. And the only way to know your usage, because people will ask me, what's my usage? I don't know. I have no clue. What you can do is use a battery monitor. That will tell you how much you're using. That will also tell you how much you got left in your battery. So if you're thinking about installing solar panels, I would say don't. The first thing you should do is install one of those. That will tell you how much of your battery you're using. Maybe you're going to realize, oh my God, I'm killing my battery. I need to install more battery. Or maybe the answer is to be able to regenerate. Maybe the answer is that you need a bigger power bank. Maybe there's things you're doing that you didn't realize you were using so much power. But at the end of the day, you're going to know how much you're using. So you really, really want to get yourself one of those battery monitors. They're not super hard to install, but you have to know what you're doing. There's the potential to burn your boat down if you do it wrong. Because what's going to happen is everything going to your ground will go through that first, and that's how it measures. That is on the house side. You don't care about your battery level on your start, because it's going to be full most of the time. You're going to use some power to start your engine, then you're going to recharge it with your alternator, and then it's going to be full again. Nor can you accurately calculate how much you have, because its ability is not in terms of capacity, but in terms of the ability to give you that big boost of power. We can skip the wiring. I really want, and you have different models available on the market. I would not do that, because that doesn't give you historical data. It doesn't tell you how much you have left. It just tells you, oh, you have so much going through right now. But a minute later, it could be half, and half an hour later, it could be double. So you want to have something that is able to calculate whatever comes in, whatever comes out, and log it. The two good, cheap options, you have some of those on Amazon that keep showing up under different brands every 6 months. I have one of them. I like it. It works fine. The Renogy is probably the better option. You also have clones of the Renogy. They're a little bit cheaper. They're doing the exact same thing. And they're available for around $80-some. So they're very, very worthwhile install. And the first thing I would install, before adding batteries, before adding solar panels. Oh, I have a little bit of duplication. So once we've calculated how much we're using, the other question is how much wattage a panel do I need to make up for that? So let's say your daily draw is 50 amp hours, and you figured out that, you know what, I have enough batteries, I need to be able to recharge them. So your goal might be to be fully off-grid. Your goal might be to just recharge from weekend to weekend. Because keep in mind, if you don't have a fridge, and let's say you're only coming here the weekend, well, you have the whole week to recharge. So that's going to make a difference. Is how much time you have to charge it and how much you're drawing. If you have a fridge, though, you have that thing running all the time. So one of the methods to calculate it, which is very much sailor cowboy science, and that's an average. That is not a science, and you're always better to err on the side of caution and get more. Having too much power is a great problem to have. You get to run an air fryer. Now, what you can do is take the amount of watts, divide that by 4, and that's going to give you more or less the average daily output in amp hours. I know we're taking watts into amp hours. It makes no sense. It's just cowboy, sailor, science logic. Take your watts, divide them by 4. It should give you more or less on average. If it's a day which is very cloudy, you're going to get less. If it's bright and sunny, you're going to get more. But on average, it should be around that. So if your daily draw is 50 amp hours and you want to have basically full off-grid capability every day, how much solar do you need? 200, which is a lot of people say. Often you'll hear people, how much do I need? 200, you'll be fine, which is pretty wise. Not everybody might be okay with 200. It might be too much, it might be too little, but generally speaking, it's not a bad number. I'm still much more fond of calculating your usage than figuring out exactly what you need. And then you can put more if you want, more if you need. My recommendation is if you figure you need 200, but you have the room for 400, put the 400. What's the worst that's going to happen? Too much power? It's a great problem to have. Because let's say, for example, you'll only be out for a full week and it's basically rainy and overcast the whole time. You're going to be generating very, very slowly. So you want to have a lot to make the best of whatever sunlight hours we have. All good for that? Does everybody understand how to calculate their draw and how to calculate how much solar you need to make up for it? And to calculate your draw is very simple. Use the right device. Use a battery monitor. It will tell you what your battery is at. So if at the end of 24 hours, if you start with your battery at 100% and you have 100 amp hours and you're at 50%, 24 hours later, well, you've used 50. Get 200 watts of solar panels, you're back up to where you need to be. So the items you'll need is obviously the solar panel, either single or multiple. Solar wire, it is a special wire. What is special about it? It is rated for UV protection. The marine wire you're going to get is meant to be used inside the boat. It's not outside rated. The UVs will kill it in no time. It's very easy to spot. There's not a sheet that goes over it. It's just 2 wires. They're black, pretty big. It's a fairly big rubber around it, again, to protect from the UV. For those that are curious, it is also 10 gauge. You need a charge controller, because if you try to wire that to your battery directly, they will not like it. And you need a fuse. You always need fuses on everything, including on solar panels. Not so much between the panel and your controller, but between the controller and the battery, specifically on the battery side. Now, if you guys remember when we talked about the batteries, you can have in series, you can have in parallel. Same thing applies for solar panels. Now, when it came to the batteries, the type of batteries you had dictated how you had to connect them. If you had 6 volts, you put them in series. If you had 12 volts, you put them in parallel. Most people, for the batteries, is just parallel and just put the positive together and the negatives together. For the solar panels, you have the option. If you want to use multiple panels on the same controller, you can have them in series, where you're going to be adding the voltage. You can also have them in parallel, where basically the plus goes with the plus, the ground with the ground, and then you're adding your amperage. The challenge with parallel potentially is that your wire can only sustain so much amperage. Your charge controller also can only sustain so much amperage. But the main thing is the wire. Let's say if you have a very large array, let's say for example this one, so each panel there, we assume it's 12 volts, 5 amps. If we were to have an array of 10, which is absolutely ridiculous, we would not want to do an array of 10, we would end up with 50 amps. Who here is a bit of an electrical nerd here? 50 amps on a 10 gauge wire. Yeah, it's going to get a little toasty. So your solar wire is always 10 gauge. Now you don't need to remember that. Just remember it has a fixed capacity. So if you were to have a very large solar panel or multiple large solar panels in parallel, you're going to grill that wire pretty good. So you might be better off going with a higher voltage, because what is hard to handle for the wire is not the voltage. The wires we use for the 12 volt could do 120. They could do 300 without problem. What the limit is the amperage. And actually the 12 volt, the wires we use for our 12 volt systems are very often bigger than for a 120 volt system. For that reason, because we're pulling so much more amperage. Wires can handle voltage very easily, as long as it's within reason. Amperage is what results in loss in heat and all those things. Now, one of the easiest things to do is simply have one controller per panel. If you can afford it, if it works for you, that's great. That's perfect way to do it, and you're not going to have issues with shading. As we mentioned, the solar wire is always 10 gauge. It's going to use a specific wire, which we see a little bit there. It's also going to use specific connectors. You'll notice a wonderful red O-ring. These are watertight because they will be exposed to the elements. Imagine you're in a saltwater environment, salt water gets in there, it could be bad news. I do not want to badmouth any business. I'm very fond of SolarCity. Who here is familiar with SolarCity? Oh. They're good, they're great. I like them. Do not buy their solar wire. The reason for that is their solar wire is not marine wire. It's the same 10 gauge, but the cable is not tin coated, so it doesn't have as good corrosion resistance, and also the strands are bigger, so it's not as flexible. It is meant for household use. So they are great. You can go there and buy in confidence your solar panels and your charge controllers. Do not buy their solar wire. If they can get you marine wire, that's great. But I would still ask them, because it's not anything wrong with them. They're not marine experts. But ask to see the wire. You will see if it's tin coated. If it's tin coated, it'll be silver color. Everybody knows what copper looks like. If you have a wire that looks like copper, it is not a marine wire. Marine wire will have multiple small strands, and it's also going to be tin coated, so it will look silver color. So if there's a single strand, stay away. Multiple larger strands, stay away. Or if it looks like copper, stay away. Those are not marine wire. And again, not to dismiss them. They are awesome. I really like them. I've bought from them in the past. I will buy from them again. But I made the mistake of ordering wire from them once, and I realized I should have known better. It was my mistake, not theirs. So pretty clear on the wire. It's standard, it's 10 gauge, so you can only carry so much. Depending if you have them running in parallel or if you have them running them in series. If you have them in series, you have your positive to your negative, so you're going to connect the panels together. And then you're going to have one, so you have two, one positive from one going to your controller, one negative from the other going to your controller, and the positive and negative of each other connected together, so you don't need additional wires. I'll get to it in a second. If you run them in parallel, you will need to combine them to some kind of either two-way Y splitter or three-way Y splitter or something along those lines. You could also just run a whole bunch of them to your solar controller. It will be messier. However, if there's an issue with amperage, it could be a potential solution. You'd end up kind of paralleling them right to the battery, but at that point, you're probably better off going series. Yes, you had a question. Yes. That is a great segue to our next slide. Actually, it is not arranged, but it worked out perfectly. So we have two types of solar controllers. We have what we call the PWM solar controllers. We have the MPPT solar controllers. Let's take that example of we have 24 volts coming in, which is very plausible. Large panels are not going to be 12 volts ever. Reason for that is that would be a whole lot of amperage. So the PWM controllers, what they say, you have 24 volts coming in. Well, they're going to take 12, and the rest of the 12, bye-bye. They're not going to convert it. They're not going to convert it to 12 volts. They're just going to cut it off, give it a haircut, basically. So if you have 24 volts coming in at 10 amps, it's not going to be like, oh, I can do 12 volts, 20 amps. No, 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 no. You have 24 volts, 10 amps, you get 12 volts, 10 amps. And that other 12 volts, 10 amps, those are very dumb controllers. They just give a haircut. That's what they do. They cut it off so it doesn't grill your battery. They don't use it. Bye-bye. So if you have a PWM controller, get rid of it. The MPPT controllers are a bit more expensive, but they're absolutely worth it. They will convert any extra voltage to amperage, which your battery will be able to absorb, so you will not have loss. In the case of a PWM, you will have huge losses, which can go from anywhere to 10 to 20% if you have a 12 volt-ish solar panel. And if you have, let's say, I don't know, a 20, 36 volt solar panel, you could be looking at more than 50% loss. Usually, any kind of significantly sized controller is going to be MPPT, and they will say MPPT on it. They will say MPPT in the descriptions. It will be very clear because they're better. Nobody wants a PWM. And basically, what I say is friends don't let friends buy PWM chargers. They're awful. Don't get them. Get an MPPT. And I think we're getting pretty tight on time. We're actually getting a little over. Let's see what more we have. And basically, you have to choose the features you want. Make sure that you have that it supports the voltage you want to feed it. Make sure it supports the amperage you want to feed it, both on the panel side and on the output side. Because if we go back to the example of we have an MPPT, 24 volts coming in, we're going to have double the amperage coming out. So you want to make sure that it supports the voltage and the amperage on both sides. And that's pretty much it. We're running out of time, so if you guys have any questions, we had questions that were submitted ahead of time that we've integrated into the deck. If you guys have additional questions, we can answer them.
Any other questions for Eric? We've got a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add that we raised $301 for the Legacy
Awesome.
Fund tonight.
Awesome.
And come on back next week for Sean Batten and our Sale
Nice.
Activities Center. But thanks, Eric.
Nice.
We probably could do a
Thank you,
weekend
guys.
retreat on this topic.